Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ektron Developer Office Hours, spinning it back up after a couple of months hiatus, and diving right in this week with intranets and extranets. So we'll be talking a little bit about best practices, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, tips and tricks, very high-level overview of implementing intranets and extranets, also known as portals, using Ektron. So if anybody has any questions, please reach out to us via Twitter using the EktronOH hashtag. So we'll be watching that and answering questions live. And with that, I'll let Joe introduce himself first.
My name is Joe Mayberry. I'm a web developer with WSOL and a lead Ektron partner.
Okay, Joe, you've been using Ektron for a while, and I know that we've worked on intranets and extranets type stuff together, and
Sure.
you've had even more experience racked up since then. That was several years ago. And Ken.
I'm Ken McAndrew, Senior Technology Consultant at Celerity, also an Ektron partner. And it's been, what, 3, 4 years of Ektron, 5 years, I think.
Close to
Making this-
5. Yeah,
Yeah,
close to
something
5.
like that.
Yeah, because you were at C-SPAN when you started, and
Yeah,
we didn't actually work together on that project, but we worked,
sadly.
I'll say, near each other on that one. That's as close
Yeah.
as we can say. All right, so let's dive right in. Again, the theme is intranet and extranet. One of the questions that I sent to you guys ahead of time was, what are general challenges with intranets and extranets, say maybe as opposed to public-facing website? And Ken, I'll let you lead off with that question.
Usually the biggest challenge is going to be users. When you're dealing with intranets and extranets, you're going to have a user base of logins, whereas you may have it on a public site, you may not. The hard part when it comes to users is because Ektron divides it to a CMS user versus a membership user. When you're putting things together, you have to remember if you're using CMS users for whatever reason, if you use Page Builder and they're logged in, they're going to start seeing Page Builder bars, and with Ektron 9, they're going to see the full the regular bar as well. So you don't want CMS users really being your quote-unquote members. So the better idea is to use the membership. Now, then you run into issues where if you're using Active Directory or LDAP, Active Directory, I don't believe, connects up to membership users. LDAP, I don't know if LDAP does either, but your tie-ins may not be what you want them to be. So it's a pain point potentially, especially if you're trying to manage your Ektron users through your Windows AD environment.
Okay, yeah, I can see definitely how that could be a challenge, especially because you do want some people to have authoring capabilities in that environment, and you want some people not to. So you have to figure that out ahead of time. That should be part of your planning. Is what systems do you need in order to manage both sets of users?
Yeah, and also, do you want to, have everybody have if you're an author, you have an author account, and they'll have to deal with having editing bars or whatever, or do they have an authoring account and do they have a membership account, and if they just need day-to-day use, they go in as a membership user. If they need to do any authoring, then they can go in the back end as a CMS user. National Geographic, was one intranet we did here. It's using Okta, actually, as a third-party single sign-on, but that's logging people in, authenticating them through that system, and then they have CMS accounts to do the work. So it doesn't log them directly into the CMS necessarily, even though it takes advantage of like user profiles and the like. With American Diabetes, we ended up using membership users. Originally, we were going to use CMS users until we run into the problem I mentioned. So we made all membership users for people, but then we did it where we said, okay, if you're logging into the intranet, then you're going to get just the regular interface, and you have to log into the CMS extra in order to get the authoring environment, and so we're able to use LDAP with the CMS users and use a custom LDAP to log them in with that. But then we created, quote unquote, fake membership users to take care of permissioning and stuff like that.
Well, that's all the membership users in that scenario would be anyway, or even the CMS users. They're just proxy accounts, and the authentication is just a pass through to that other system. Ektron doesn't actually store your Active Directory password or your LDAP password,
right?
For example. So it's pass through authentication with the third-party system, regardless. And I think that's pretty standard. I've seen other systems, including learning management systems, that operate the same way. It carries a proxy user within the system and does pass through for certain profile information and authentication.
Mm-hmm.
So, Joe, let's talk general challenges. What have you seen, either intranet or extranet, which would be a portal?
Yeah, I'm kind of with Ken. I think one of the biggest challenges really is the users, and more on the security side. Especially when you're dealing with an intranet, you're dealing with a lot of either secured data, and you want to make sure that the right people have the right access, or it's inside of a firewall, and so you don't have to worry so much that people get access to it, but then there's the challenges of trying to access something through a firewall or being on the right side of it. That I've seen a lot of those issues where people just don't have the right access because the groups aren't set up. They didn't think it through correctly enough or thoroughly enough.
Yeah, so I think the common theme here is planning is key.
Yes.
Whether you're working with where people need to authenticate and how you segment your user base, or what kind of grouping and permissioning you need to do around those users, it all boils down to upfront planning and trying to make sure that you're prepared.
Yeah, I think going along with the permissioning thing, one thing you have to remember when you're setting up your permissions in the CMS is you can set your groups up and attach them to permissions all day long, but if you don't turn on the private checkbox, it's not going to matter because that's what limits it to you can only browse if you're in the groups. One of the shortfalls I think right now with permissioning is Ektron doesn't do like SQL does what I call negative permissioning. So if you go into SQL and you tell you're a member of two groups, in Group A you have permission, in Group B you're denied permission, you're denied access. Whereas in Ektron, if you're in multiple groups, if you have permission in even one group, you have access. So you have to plan very carefully because if you're giving a group access to, say, financial data, but realistically there's a couple people in one of those groups that shouldn't have access to it, you don't have any way of denying them without saying create a third group to make sure only those certain people are in there. So you have to be a little more cognizant of your permissioning, I think.
Well, it is more the Windows model of permissioning. Yeah, which is all administrators are users, but not all users are administrators, for example.
Right.
So yeah, it's more that route than the negative permissioning, as you said. And I think that's just a matter of preference. And I can certainly see the benefit to doing negative permissioning, but it's what works best for most people is what it boils down to. So we do have a comment on Twitter, and again, if you're watching and you have a question or a comment that you'd like to add to the discussion, jump onto Twitter, use the EktronOH hashtag. So Kenny's comment is one benefit of membership users in a multi-site scenario is you can use groups to grant access to different sites using the same login. So yes, that's the one nice thing about multi-site is consolidation of user accounts and groups within a single instance of the CMS to serve multiple sites. Right, so what other considerations, what are things that you might be able to do with an intranet or extranet that you would have a difficult time doing on an external facing site where you may or may not have authenticated users?
Integration with internal systems, I think, is a big thing. If you've got an intranet, an internal portal inside of your firewalls, you've got a lot less hoops to jump through to access internal databases, internal systems to integrate those systems with your website.
Yeah, that's true. And Ken, what do you think?
I mean, that's definitely one. I'm trying to think what else would I do with it differently. So I'm drawing a blank on that one because there's a lot of stuff that you could do that I mean, a lot of what you do externally, you can do internally. You may not have to. One thing you could probably get away with is maybe not as much caching depending on your user base. External site, you could have a ton of visitors. You don't know what your base is. Internal site, you know more along what your user base is going to be, and for performance purposes, you may not need to cache data as long as you would on an external site, or at all, depending on what it needs to be, like alerts or things like that.
Yeah, I'd say with an internal site, the biggest advantage is the knowns. If you're looking at an intranet specifically, you are more likely, depending on your organization, to know the types of browsers, know the types of devices that are being used to access the site or that are approved for accessing your intranet site. While that may depend on organization, I do think it's definitely a lot more common. It's something that you see maybe in 50% plus of the intranet cases, at least in my experience, that you know what you're developing for a lot more clearly, which is not always a great thing because you do come across some organizations who have standardized on Internet Explorer 8 or something, and you have to support that 100%. Everything has to be perfect on an IE8 for whatever reason, or IE7, because that's what they've standardized on, and they don't want to upgrade for whatever reason.
On the flip side of that, though, it is a known, so you can focus on that and not say, okay, we've got to support everything from Internet Explorer 6 up to 11 and everything else, and as you said, it's a known.
Yeah. So the other big known is the users themselves. With an externally facing site, I would say you're relying a lot on implicit data if you want to do any kind of targeting or personalization, if you want to really customize the site for a visitor. Then unless they log in and tell you information, you don't know anything about them. But with internal information, you can get departments, you can get much better segmentation. It's all explicit information. You already have their contact info. So there's a bit more that you can do to personalize a site very directly for those visitors on an intranet because you do know who they are.
Yeah, and you can even go as far as with personalization if you wanted to store in the user profile, like they like a certain theme of the website. If you give them a choice of themes, for example, or other cutesy things like that, you can store that information. You have a little more creative freedom when you're doing that. One thing back on the browsers, I think that's where when it comes to like known browsers, IT policy and the intranet policy really has to be established there, because with so many more bring your own device deals, or companies aren't necessarily standardizing on a specific platform, like at our company you can choose Mac or PC. So when you're dealing with that, you need to know, you can say these are the standard ones, but understand somebody's going to probably come in that doesn't have one of the quote-unquote approved browsers, and then it's up to an IT policy to decide, do you basically say, okay, we'll work with you, or do you tell them, here's the list, and that's what you're stuck with? And that's, that needs to be established, I think, in part, again, back to planning, so that you're very clear when you're developing it, we're going to develop it to these standards, and beyond that, we're not going to apply it even if somebody's got that, because these are what we say it should be.
No, I agree, and it varies by industry and company type and company just mentality in general. Where you're at an agency, I think the mentality is much more flexible than at other organizations. So a healthcare organization, for example, is going to be much more strict about what devices are brought in, how they're supported, and what software is approved. Or it just depends on the use of the machines that are being employed to access the intranet. So healthcare is an example. You have multiple people using the same workstation. So they tend to standardize a lot more. Or in manufacturing, you might have multiple people in a warehouse using the same terminal. So
Yeah.
it varies by industry.
Yeah, and then you may also have my thoughts go away from me sometimes. It's like
Look
I had
around on
a
the floor.
thought.
Maybe it fell out of your ear or something.
Yeah.
But going back to personalization and targeting, there was a site that I wanted to mention that Joe and I had worked on several years ago, but it was an 8.5 version of the site, so it was a modern search technology version of Ektron, where I know, Joe, you and I spent weeks kind of perfecting. I'm going to say perfecting, even though I don't think it was perfect. But we spent weeks to really get a search tool to be as narrow in focus as possible and as efficient as possible. But one of the cool things about that, I think in that scenario, they were tagging users with taxonomy, and they were tagging content with the same taxonomy. And so you could take the users and read what categories the users are in. It could be what departments they work under, what areas of the country they work in, or areas of the world, or something like that. And you could take that, read the information from the user, apply it through search to the content that you want to surface, and create personalized experiences. So you can tag all of your content with region, department, whatever you need, and just use this user settings to filter that content. And I thought that was a really cool idea. They used that not for the entire web experience on that site, but it was probably, I'm thinking, 2/5 to 50% of every page.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. I remember we struggled a lot with that, trying to dial it into working within the parameters of the technology. Whether that's SQL or whatnot, and the search capabilities, and getting the right results.
yeah, we ended up getting it in the end. They're still using that code. I actually talked to them a couple of months ago. They're still using the same code and are very happy with it to this day. So that's a win, in my opinion. If it's stood the test of time for a couple of years and it's still performing well, then I'm pretty happy. But I think that's kind of the kind of personalization that I think is something you can do inside of a intranet or extranet, where you have a known set of users, that would be much more challenging, or you would have to approach in a much different way for any other kind of website. So, Ken, any of the intranet sites you've worked on doing personalization, not necessarily at that level, but using knowns based on user profiles to do personalization of the site?
We're doing, one of the sites did like some menu personalization based on permissions. Another one is using the user profile as kind of a storage mechanism. When it was on 8.7, they were using MS Search Server and bringing in like data from PeopleSoft and crawling that as a BDC type. But with Solar, they don't really have those external sites, so there's instead a process that brings all that data into the user profile in Ektron, and then that makes all that data searchable through the Solar search. In future versions, it could be that you could take that data, now that you have all that data stored, and you could do more personalization. So you're like, okay, well, they're in, this office, so we'll, target some stuff towards that. It just gives more capabilities. So it's kind of an example, bringing in those external parts, and basically using Ektron to store them so that you're not overwhelming your other systems, but also everything's available to the search criteria, as well as, of course, the the basic APIs.
Yeah. So when do you update that information if it's being pulled from another system? When do you find is the best time? Do you do an overnight batch, or do you do what?
Yeah.
On login?
It's like a 4 or 5 a.m. batch, and then with that one, what we're doing is as it's you look up the data from the external source, do a quick compare. If there's any data changes, it updates the data, and then it's also being used to put all the users into cache. So, trying to eliminate some of the more expensive operations on logins. So it can pre-cache all that data as it's doing this, and if there is a change, you can just drop the cache for that person and put them back in with the new information. And then, right now it's doing it I think once a day, but they might eventually get it to like once an hour or something, just to check if there's new users, for example, make sure that they can get in the system. That just becomes a matter of once you get it down to where it's like everything's pre-cached, you're able to go in and say, all right, we're just going to replace this one item of cache instead of like the first user of the day shows up and all this stuff has to be cached up because the system's starting up. So there's also like ping utility to make sure the application never sleeps, so you don't lose your cache.
Right. Yeah, so I've done it with an on login action, Joe. That's another part of what you and I did together.
Mm-hmm.
Was basically taking information from a reverse proxy that was passing the authentication data. It was providing the authentication mechanism and just passing us a yes or no with related data to the site, and we were doing an on login. But I think it depends on the number of users, whether you want to go batch or whether you want to go on login. So Ken, it sounds like you were dealing with probably a very large number of users.
Yeah, there's a few thousand users involved, and then there's also just you're looking at how much other stuff is happening when the person logs in. You log in, you're going to go to the home page. What's happening? How much time is that all going to take to load up those various components, and where should you be spending your operation time? Your quote unquote budget for load time without it just dragging. So in this case, the more it's pre-cached, the better, and then it's just you don't need to worry about it, and you can put things on different cache times, which we're starting to move into the database and the dictionary settings idea, so the cache times can be changed dynamically as time goes on.
Right, Joe, did you have something to add there?
I mean, that sounds good. One of the big things that we found with a site we worked on about a year ago or so is you've got to have a smart caching strategy. We were dealing with a internal site that had a large number of users and a really large number of content items, notifications, things like that, that we had to match up users to the content items to make sure that they've acknowledged it, they've read it, type of thing. Some of them were required, some were not. So it was a really, really complex kind of dance around who saw what. And it was interesting because the solution that we finally came up with was to do a custom solution where we pulled some of the metadata for the content, the title, IDs, some of the folder paths, stuff like that, stored that in an external database table, and then queried that, cached it, and then we used Link to filter out the pieces for the individual users as they come in throughout the day. Instead of trying to pull down large numbers of content items and objects and then have to filter through that.
So it sounds like you were normalizing the data in order to provide quicker access.
We were, and what that gave us the ability to do is we could just look up and provide a list of, okay, here's these items for this user that's completely different from the one from the next user, but we're pulling from the same data set. And then when they actually need to go in there and see the details, then we can go and retrieve that one content item and cache its results for the next person that might need it. But we didn't have to cache 3,000 different content items at a time.
Yeah, sounds like there might have been an opportunity, and maybe not in this situation, but Search is going to do something similar. Search normalizes the data for quick access. So based on what fields are required, but if you're merging multiple data types, into that table, then that might be a different case, and you might need
Yeah.
that extra data table. Or perhaps if you want to use search technology to provide that, you can create a custom scope and push data into a custom scope instead of fields inside of a search engine as well. Right, so another comment from Kenny: membership groups plus collections plus DMS docs plus Telerik's panel bar, which I'm not familiar with, equals powerful presentation option. What's the panel bar do, Kenny? But I ask that one.
Respond quickly.
You have 4 minutes.
Yeah. The other thing with permissions that we found in terms of performance is we actually just did an upgrade recently from 8.7 to 9.1. And there was something odd where the performance was really dragging. It turned out to be around the user manager. We were running just straight user manager, no admin, access modifier specified, so it's running in logged in mode. And it was doing these extra permission checks that it really didn't need to do for the purpose we were doing it. And funny enough, we put it in admin mode, and that solved the problem. So, chalk that up to a total weirdness. But, with intranets especially, it becomes a little more, you have to think a little bit more about, you can't just maybe blanket do admin everywhere, because especially with content manager and I'd say even search manager, you're going to want to not run those in admin, because if something is run in private mode, admin will just blow right by that. So, thinking about your API usage. So, you got to use them smartly, I think. You can get away with admin mode for a lot of the read stuff, for some of the APIs, but depending on how your intranet is set up, if you're using the permissions, you're not going to be able to use it for everything. And then if you do any, writes of anything like message boards or just, writing to content, uploading content through the admin or through the admin system, basically, or the internet instead of the work area, you don't do it with the admin context, because it'll just store it as internal admin. You lose your quality control, and i.e. know who to blame if something screws up.
Yeah, it's going to run under the admin, internal admin user context. So if you're doing any personalization or targeting as well, then it's going to have an impact there. But you're right, you can definitely blow past some of those private content permissions and such. So because intranets tend to have a lot more content segmentation and a lot more of those privacy settings, you do have to be even further cognizant of using that admin mode than you would perhaps in other sites. But I think as a rule of thumb, I tell people not to use it unless they have to, regardless of what kind of site they're building. And when they do use it, make sure that they're doing it in a safe way. Okay, so Kenny says that the Telerik panel bar is a full-featured accordion control. Okay. So yeah, I can see how that combination would be quite nice. I don't have a lot of experience with Telerik's controls outside of the editor, and I'm not going to say that was a fun experience when we were using that. Not many people argue with that. All right, so let's get some final thoughts here. What advice would we offer the community at large for getting started and doing things right the first time?
Plan. I mean, seriously, knowing, we've talked before on these things, and I think we've all written blogs or read blogs about organizing your projects and organizing your content, and when you're using Page Builder and all that. But I think especially when it comes to an intranet, you really want to plan that ahead, because more so than a public website, you're going to have the permissions issues. You're going to want to make things simple, which means you're going to want to use permission inheritance, and you don't want to start, doing copy and paste or cut and paste in the work area once you figure out, oh, I really wanted to do it this way. So a good content strategy is going to be key, as well as the user strategy, the membership strategy. Again, back to what are the permissions, how are we doing the members, how are we logging them in. I think you've got to do more planning ahead when you're doing an intranet than you do an extranet, or not an extranet, but a public website. Even an extranet, you have to have that plan ahead.
Okay, Joe, any advice for people getting started on an intranet or portal?
Yeah, I'm with Ken on that one. A lot of planning. It's as technical people, as programmers, stuff like that, we like to just jump in and start working on something. But we've really doing just a little bit of planning up front will save you a lot of rework in the long term.
Okay, so the one piece that I'm going to throw out is content strategy and structured content specifically for an intranet. I know that we preach that a lot for any website, but for an intranet, there are a lot more conditions for reuse of content than you have on most public-facing sites. You'll have 3 or 4 different ways that the same content will be displayed across 5 or 6 templates. So I'd say definitely focus on well-structured, well-defined content types for that reuse. You often find more reuse of content that goes external to the site with interior digital signage or things of that nature. So there's a lot more reason to make sure you have a very solid structured content strategy for an intranet or extranet. And with that, we're a couple minutes over time, but I think we started a minute or 2 late anyway, so I think we're about hitting the mark on the half hour. And anybody has any follow-up questions, please do reach out. We will answer questions posted to the Google event page. We do take questions live via Twitter during these events. So if you have any questions, post them to Twitter using hashtag Ektron or hashtag EktronOH as a follow-up to this, or post comments or questions to the Google event page, and we'll follow up asynchronously with that. And with that, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Ken, for coming back to Ektron Office Hours after a brief sabbatical. And we'll see you in probably a couple of weeks. We're going to have another Office Hours next week and the week following. Might be different cast. You might have some familiar faces as well. But we'll see everybody in a week.
Great. Thanks.
Right. Thanks.